Hello, Dr. Greg here again with another sugar video on the sugar's effect on the brain. Now, I want to make something pretty clear about sugar. You know, in the beginning of my series, I talked about hidden sugar, where sugar is found that you don't even realize it's there, like in spaghetti sauce or in those power drinks or sports drinks or even, barbecue sauce, ketchup. All those things have sugar in it that increase our uptake of sugar dramatically. And so when we have that candy bar or that piece of cake or that muffin, we feel like we're rewarding ourselves because we think we didn't have any sugar, but actually we had a ton of sugar. So understand where sugar is hidden, understand the food engineers that put sugar in our foods so that we become addicted to them. It's important to understand that so that it's not so daunting to sort of avoid the piece of cake or the chocolate candy bar or the little sweet here or there, which if you don't have all that other sugar is not going to make a huge impact on you. So that's a very important thing to understand. I think that's one of the most important things to understand is the amount of sugar we take that we don't know about. That is the problem. So with that in mind, I talked about the brain and learning and memory with the brain-derived neurotropic factor, the hippocampus. I also talked about how pain is processed in the brain and how sugar, large amounts of sugar or insulin can actually destroy nerves in your brainstem, and you're not able to process pain properly, and you have pain in your elbow, and the elbow's not a problem, but you got pain there. I mean, that's coming from your brain. Now, I'm going to go head on and address Alzheimer's, and specifically Alzheimer's, but other what we call tauopathies. Now, when I say tau, what the heck is tau? Well, tau is a protein that is naturally occurring in our brain. Now, what I'm going to do is I have a couple research papers about, the first one is called The Link Between Tau and Insulin Signaling, Implications for Alzheimer's Disease and Other Tauopathies. Insulin signaling, so you understand what that is insulin helping cells to gather up glucose. So in other words, the cell needs glucose for energy, right? And it gets processed by the cell into energy currency that it can use to be able to do what it's supposed to do. Nerve cells are like every other cell in the body. They need energy in order to do it properly. But if there is a problem with insulin signaling, and we talked about that before, we called it insulin resistance, there's a problem with the uptake of glucose, which causes a problem for the cell to perform its duties normally and have the energy to do so. So this paper looked at tau bodies, and tau bodies are the new implication of Alzheimer's and other tauopathies. So just follow me here because it's a little complicated. I tried to make it as easy as I can. It's complicated for me to understand. So what is a tau protein? Now, a tau protein is normally found in your brain, and it normally does things to your nerve cells and other cells of the body so that they function normally. So in other words, they do something what we call microtubule dynamics. So tubes, think of microtubules as little tiny plumbing in your nerves, and they make so that things can be transported within the nerve so it can use it and function normally. They're important for the infrastructure of nerve cells, okay? That's what they're supposed to do. Now, insulin signaling is important for neuroplasticity, memory formation, and therefore is essential for proper brain function. And we talked about memory, and we talked about learning and how the hippocampus is involved in that, along with the brain-derived neurotropic factor. All that is important, and insulin signaling, a proper insulin signaling, in other words, insulin says, okay, cell, you take this glucose up so you can do your job, basically, is important for that to work. If a nerve cell doesn't get food properly, it's not going to work properly. It's sort of basic, right? So Tau has recently been characterized as an important regulator of insulin signaling. In other words, its normal function is there to help insulin signal normally so the cell can do its job. In other words, it's microtubules, it's there to help the infrastructure, the plumbing, of the cell to function normally, and it helps insulin to do that job. Now, what happens though is there's something called phosphorylation, and there's also something called hyperphosphorylation. Now, it's a process. So our cells, our proteins, the proteins in our bodies go through all sorts of processes, right? Chemical reactions that make things happen. Now, tau needs to be phosphorylated to function normally, but there's something called hyperphosphorylation. Now, hyperphosphorylation of tau actually makes it come off its job in the cell as a microtubule filament creator, and it clumps. It just clumps together. And now those clumps can be found under an MRI. You can actually find these tau body clumps throughout the brain. Now, what does that really mean? Now, so is the key here. So the key here is we have tau bodies that are supposed to do things that are tau protein that does things normally for the nerve cells. And it also helps regulate insulin. But what happens is it gets hyperphosphorylated, which then leads to cognitive decline because there's these clumps of tau bodies interfering with nerve transmission. That's kind of like what is going on. Now, there's a few things to understand that before I go into the million-dollar question, how do tau bodies get hyperphosphorylated or hyperprocessed, so to speak? There is a link to what that does, and I'm sure you can guess what that is that the activity within the brain can be measured to see a bit of a decline even before tau bodies appear. That's kind of interesting. That's some new research that's come out over the past several months that they've actually discovered that there is a decrease in brain activity on a very microscopic level that could give you a insight into whether this individual is going to have Alzheimer's or dementia related to tau bodies. So that's even before tau bodies appear. So here's the interesting thing. They discovered in a paper, high glucose induces formation of tau hyperphosphorylation. Wow. So what do you think of that? High glucose actually makes the tau protein hyperphosphorylated. And I told you that hyperphosphorylation causes the tau protein to aggregate and to clump up in your brain. High glucose, high sugar, hyperphosphorylates tau protein. So is the secret to Alzheimer's here? Have they figured it out? They may have. With that being said, remember, the hidden sugar is your enemy. Not the candy bar, not the dark chocolate, not the cake, as long as you have one piece. I'm not saying you have a million, but it's the hidden sugar that's the enemy and something you need to root out and defeat. This is Dr. Greg, changing the way we look at health.